Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Eli. I'm the communication strategist for the climate team. As we wait for others to join the meeting, please feel free to drop a few things in the chat, including your name, pronouns, the organization, if you're representing one, and what brings you to today's event. We'll get started shortly. Also, just a reminder that this meeting is being recorded, and Wayne Grabowski is providing technical support, so feel free to reach out through a direct message to them at any time if you're experiencing any difficulties or have any questions. Hi, everyone. For those who just joined us, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Eli. I'm the communication strategist for the climate team. And as we wait just another minute, as people join the meeting, please feel free to share the following in the chat: your name, pronouns, organization, if you're representing one, and what brings you to today's event. As a reminder, the meeting is being recorded and Wayne Grabowski is providing technical support. So feel free to direct message them anytime you're experiencing difficulties.
I'm going to wait just a few more minutes before I kick it off, since climate staff is still outnumbering public quite a bit. Hopefully we'll get a few more. Okay, well, I guess I will get us started, since we don't even have, maybe next time we'll have a soundtrack to get us through the beginning while we're waiting for folks to join. Good evening, everyone. I'm Andrea Jacob. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the climate program manager at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. We're really excited to have everyone here for our third climate conversation. I'm also joined by the climate team here at BPS. So if everyone just raise your hand and say, hey. Our screen names all begin with BPS, so you know who we are. We're here tonight to discuss the progress that we've made on our climate emergency work plan. Our agenda tonight will just go over a little bit of an introduction to the climate emergency work plan and the progress report. We have two staff that are going to present some highlights from the progress report and from the progress that we've made. We'll have some time for question and answer and discussion. And this is called a climate conversation, so we really do want to talk to folks and open it up. And then we'll save a little bit of time at the end for what's coming next for the climate team and the climate program. So with that, I will just get us started into the overview. Next slide, please. So the Climate Emergency Work Plan was adopted by City Council, Portland City Council, in August of 2022. It is the current climate action plan for the city of Portland. The plan was laid out by 10 bureaus to reduce carbon and to make Portland and Portlanders more resilient to climate change. It includes 47 priority actions to complete or move forward over a 3-year time frame. And roughly half the actions deal with reducing carbon, while the other half address climate resilience. So what that means is these are activities and investments that help our community adapt to the day-to-day impacts of climate change that are already here. And our intent as a city is to do all this work through the lens of our core city values of anti-racism, equity, transparency, and collaboration. So our work must respond to the reality that people on the front lines of climate change are the most vulnerable to its impacts. Our houseless community, elders who are isolated in their homes, low-income folks, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color Portland communities. So this is the first of a 3-year plan. The progress report talks about narratives, high-level themes, and then really drills in to the details of each action that's in the climate emergency work plan. So we're not going to go over all of that today, but we will talk about 2 of those actions in more depth. Next slide, please. So when we're talking, this is a progress report, and one standard way that cities measure their progress on climate and carbon reduction is to track our emissions. And we look at that in terms of the total amount of carbon emissions community-wide, and our community we consider Multnomah County. And we also look at our emissions per capita. So Portland has been managing and tracking our carbon emissions since 1990. So what this graph shows is a couple of different things. Number one, you can see our goals. We have the red circle at 2030 shows that we have to reduce carbon emissions 50%, and that's over from our 1990 level, which is our baseline. And then the second goal is that the red circles that say net zero at 2050. So we have 2 goals, a nearer term goal that's only about 6 years away, and then a longer term goal in 2050. And the other thing this graph shows is, so it shows our carbon emissions trajectory since 1990. And you can see that from 1990 to from 2000 to 2010, we really made a lot of progress. We reduced carbon pretty steeply. At the same time, we were welcoming more people and more jobs to Portland, showing that it was possible to grow our community and our economy at the same time reduce carbon emissions. But then things changed around 2010, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But you can see that between 2010 and roughly where we are now, that our carbon emissions have been kind of choppy up and down, but the overall slope of those reductions, that red line, is pretty flat. And you see where we need to go by 2030 and 2050. Those are pretty steep reductions. And you can see that we're not on the right trajectory to meet those reductions, those necessary reductions. So carbon emissions are not declining. So part of the message of this progress report is that there's a lot of good work that has been done, but it's not yet showing up in our carbon emissions trend. So next slide, please. So overall, the bureaus that got together, is about 10 bureaus, worked to make progress on a number of our foundational actions. So a lot of this work is really setting the stage for carbon emission reductions to come later. It's really necessary and important baseline work. It has to be done, but in and of itself is not sufficient to get us to our goals. But overwhelmingly, we are on track on most of the actions. So 43 showed forward progress. We achieved 2, and then 2 are delayed. I would say the themes of our progress report are really around transportation decarbonization, relative activity and investment and policy change on that front, and some of which you're going to hear about in a little bit from Ingrid. We did make some investments in resilience to make Portland more resilient to the flood risk that we have and the heat events that we have. And that we did make some strategic investments in East Portland, recognizing that East Portland has been a focus of the Bureau and the city in recognition of past harm and disinvestment and disenfranchisement that's happened out in East Portland. So we have good news to report, but it's kind of a good news, not great news kind of message. And I do want to say, though, that if we don't mobilize to reduce carbon emissions, our attempt to be resilient becomes increasingly more difficult and expensive. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ingrid Fish to talk a little bit more about one of our priority actions. And this has to do with transportation decarbonization.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. Again, my name is Ingrid Fish, and I'm on the climate team, and I work for the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability on transportation decarbonization policy. And I am going to maybe start off by, we're going to take a poll, which I think, Eli, you're going to put up. But let me, the question that we're going to ask all of you is, do you currently own or use one or more electric vehicles? And this could include electric cars, electric scooters, electric bikes, e-motorcycles, etc. And the answers that you can choose from are yes, no, and not yet, but I plan to buy or use one in the future. Okay, Eli, does it look like everyone's? Looks like more people are answering.
Hey, Ingrid.
Yeah, should we call it?
Yeah, actually, I something is up. I actually launched the poll and a few people answered. But it won't share for some reason. I'm not sure what's going on. Let me try it again.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
And do we answer it in the chat?
No, it should be a pop-up.
It just pops up. Okay.
Okay, are you seeing that?
Yes. Okay. Looks like the answers are coming up now. It's like 61% of participants have answered. Looks like it's working better this time.
Yeah, that's very odd. Sorry about that.
So Wing, just let me know when we should call it.
Sure, I think that's probably.
Okay. So I'm looking at 22% people answered yes, they currently own or use one or more electric vehicles. 33% said no, and 44% said not yet, but I plan to buy or use one in the future. So I think those results are telling. We have found that one of the biggest barriers to people accessing electric vehicles is access to electric vehicle charging. And so this project that I'm going to talk about kind of focuses on one segment of providing, like making it easier to provide charging. So thank you for answering that poll. It's interesting. I'm glad to see many people haven't used or owned one yet, but plan to in the future. And Eli says she thinks about 9 people responded. Okay. Okay, well, I am here to talk about action T6 in the climate emergency work plan. And that action is to adopt EV ready codes, which I am happy to say has been completed. That action is stated in the action plan as make new construction ready for electric vehicle charging. So let's go to the next slide. So let me talk a little bit about what this existing requirement is. It is, the state actually defines what EV ready means, and the state defines it as providing conduit and space on site for electrical capacity to support at least a level 2 EV charger. So these are the medium speed chargers that most people have at home, which charge vehicles in about 3 to 8 hours. So in regular speak, conduit just means pipes, and space for electrical capacity means space on the panel for future electrical capacity. So this requirement applies to multi-unit and mixed-use developments with 5 or more new dwelling units. So new construction, mixed-use or multifamily buildings that include parking. So for these types of buildings, they are now required to provide electric vehicle ready infrastructure for 50% of parking spaces when more than 6 spaces are provided, or 100% of parking spaces when 6 or few spaces are provided. Just to clarify, the developers are not required to include parking. So this doesn't apply, this requirement does not apply if parking is not included. It also does not require developers to install electrical capacity to support the chargers. It doesn't require electrical outlets or the actual EV chargers as part of this code. And then for commercial developments, the requirement defers to the state baseline, which is a requirement to install EV ready infrastructure at 20% of parking spaces. Next slide. So why is this important? Kind of going back to what Andrea was saying about carbon emissions, specifically for transportation, transportation is responsible for a large part of overall carbon emissions. It's responsible for about 44% of our carbon emissions in Multnomah County. And in Portland, emissions from the buildings and industry have declined by 35% since Portland began tracking emissions in 1990. But in contrast, the transportation sector emissions have increased, so climbing 3% over 1990 levels. Much of this is due to Portland's growing population, as Andrea mentioned, but my point is, unlike other sectors in Portland, transportation-related emissions are going in the wrong direction. So a key strategy that the city is doing to reduce emissions in the transportation sector is to transition from fossil fuel vehicles to electric vehicles. And in order to drive electric, we need charging stations to be accessible in convenient locations, such as where people live. So in addition to transitioning to EVs, we're also working to make it easier for people to walk, bike, and take public transit. And we're working to build connected communities where people live close to services, so cars are not needed to get to where we need to go. These other things are captured in other climate emergency work plan actions under the transportation and land use sections. Next slide. So getting back to the EV ready requirement, I wanted to talk a little bit about the process for how we got to the requirement being implemented. It actually took a few years to develop the EV ready code requirement. It involved addressing the state preemption issue, which prevented the city from being able to require developers to install a higher amount of EV charging infrastructure in buildings. So we needed to deal with that issue first. And then at the same time, we had conversations with community members and EV stakeholders, and we talked about how to increase EV access to renters. And this systemic approach to require developers to install EV ready infrastructure was identified in that process. We then asked many of those same stakeholders to give us input on our EV ready code concepts, and community organizations such as Verde, Imagine Black, Hacienda CDC, Portland Tenants United were all included in those conversations. We then received public input on our draft code update, and we received a recommendation from the Planning and Sustainability Commission. And that requirement was unanimously approved by Council in February of this year, and then it went into effect March 31st. Next slide. So the last slide, I'd like to just talk a little bit about why this matters in the bigger picture. So firstly, transitioning to EVs benefits the climate by reducing carbon emissions, and it also has air quality benefits. And then also up to this point, charging has been really inequitably deployed. We're finding that the private sector EV installments are typically going to higher income areas. And this requirement for the EV ready moves us closer to giving those living in multifamily buildings better access to EVs. So as a tenant, it's difficult to get these things installed because you don't own the building. And then it's much less expensive to install EV ready infrastructure at the time of construction rather than during retrofits after the project is built. And lastly, finally, states are setting goals to phase out the sale of internal combustion engines, so gas engines. And Oregon has actually committed to having all our new vehicle sales be zero emission by 2035. So in order to meet that goal, we need to have EV charging stations to fuel those vehicles, and preferably have them in places where people live because it's the most convenient place to charge. So that's the end of my slide deck. Appreciate the opportunity to share about this project.
I think I'm next up. Hi, everyone. My name is Sonrisa Cooper. I use she, her pronouns, and my position on the climate team is Sustainable Economy and Just Transition Analyst. So I work at the intersection of climate action, equity, and economic development. And in a nutshell, my job is to make sure that all of our work on the climate team creates meaningful benefits for people at the front lines of climate change. Today, I'm going to be talking about something called the Clean Industry Initiative. This is really the newest part of our decarbonization portfolio, and it is at the core of our Just Transition strategy. Clean industry is action I1 in the Climate Emergency Work Plan, and the goal of this action item is to develop strategies for the industrial sector to reduce emissions, pollution, and waste, and to follow inclusive practices. So before I get into some of the details, I wanted to do a poll as well. Wing, can you pull that up?
Yeah, I'm going to launch that. And considering the last poll, how that went, please let me know when you see that on your screens. If one of our attendees could, okay, great. See it, fantastic.
Yeah, so the question I'm curious to hear people's opinion on is, what environmental strategy from Portland's industrial sector matters the most to you? Manufacturing parts for clean energy infrastructure, clean energy jobs for underrepresented workers, new green products and markets, reduction of carbon emissions, and reduction of air pollution. So far, it looks like, oh, I don't know if people can see it. I won't give a teaser on the results yet. People can't see it. Maybe we can wait another 15 seconds or so. think we can share the results. So it looks like most people on this call are most invested in reducing carbon emissions from the industrial sector. We also had 1 vote for manufacturing parts for clean energy infrastructure. So thank you for voting. It's actually a trick question because I'm going to be talking about all of these things as part of the Clean Industry Initiative. But yeah, let's move on to the rest of the presentation. Can you move to the next slide, please? Thanks. So earlier in this presentation, you heard about our goal to slash greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030 and to reach net zero carbon by 2050. This graphic on the left shows the emissions reductions we can expect if we implemented all the policies in the climate emergency work plan. And you'll see down at the bottom that we don't really expect any major reductions from industry until at least 2030. This is because the industrial sector is especially hard to decarbonize because of the cost, the lack of widely available technology, and other political and economic factors. We recognize that challenge. And so in light of that, we've developed 4 main goals for the Clean Industry Initiative. The first is to assist Portland's industrial sector in addressing greenhouse gas emissions, as I mentioned earlier, as well as addressing toxic air pollution and waste. The second is to foster industrial climate tech innovation in Portland. This is also an economic initiative. Portland has a strong history and market for green products and technologies that will help us manage the climate crisis, like manufacturing clean energy infrastructure components or software. Prosper Portland, which is our economic development bureau, is very involved in the Clean Industry Initiative as well, and recently named climate as a core economic development strategy for Portland's growth and prosperity. The third is to identify local policy and/or funding pathways to support clean industry. So we've been working with industrial businesses for the last several years to understand what exactly is needed and feasible in terms of policy. And then the fourth goal is to create opportunities for frontline workers and communities in the emerging clean economy. So we embed climate justice principles to all of our work, and Clean Industry Initiative is aligned with our climate justice mission and strategy. I want to note that these goals they're not about specific businesses or specific projects. They're really about making systemic changes across the industrial sector that will help us meet climate goals and will also support businesses that are very important to our community. Next slide. So earlier this year, we completed a study to understand the current conditions in the industrial sector related to carbon emissions, air pollution, waste, and equity and inclusion. The study also included a scan of global clean industry models and an analysis of policy and finance tools for industry. And I know there's a lot of information on this slide and the text is kind of small, but it's important to know what was included in the study before I talk about it. So we identified 4 different subsectors of industry: food and beverage, metals and machinery, electronics, and miscellaneous manufacturing. We also included hospitals and universities because they have significant opportunities for decarbonization and circularity. And then at the bottom, you'll see we have waste management going across all of them because it is an industrial subsector on its own, and it's also a system that impacts all of the other sectors above it. That miscellaneous category covers other types of manufacturing that don't fall into the first 3 categories. So that's things like apparel and textiles, wood, plastics, chemical manufacturing. It's kind of a hodgepodge of smaller industries. Our consultants conducted a literature review. They did a survey of industrial businesses. They conducted focus groups with all of these subsectors, and they also did one-on-one interviews with businesses and utility companies to understand their challenges. In total, we contacted over 1,400 businesses for this study. Next slide. Okay, again, I know there's a lot of information on this slide, but I wanted to share this kind of high-level summary of our findings. And I find this really useful for comparing across the different types of manufacturing, which you can see over on the left. Those are the subsectors from the previous slide. And then across the top, it allows us to compare across the number of employees in the sector, total production, which is based on wages, greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, and the amount of waste generated. So when we're considering a new policy or program for clean industry, this helps us know where we should be targeting our resources. I want to call your attention to food and beverage, which is that green bar at the top, and metals and machinery, which is the orange bar near the bottom. Compared to the other categories, these ones have particularly high greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, and waste. So these rose to the top as priority areas for us to focus on in terms of their environmental impact. And they're also very important to our local economy. You know, Portland's city identity is very tied to food and beverage. And we've also had metals manufacturers working in Portland for over a century. So it's really important to us to have a better understanding of the sector. Hospitals and universities generate lower greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution, but they have by far the most employees and they generate quite a lot of waste. So in this sector, we should be focusing on equity and workforce development and looking for opportunities for circularity and waste reduction. That miscellaneous category is that big gray bar in the middle, and that covers many smaller sub-industries that tend to have lower employment, but still generate significant greenhouse gas, air pollution, and waste. And this grouping of sub-industries has pretty diverse needs when it comes to decarbonization because they're all so different from each other. So we need to do more exploration to understand how we can help those types of businesses. Next slide. Our next steps over the coming year are mainly to implement the recommendations from the Clean Industry Study. The top priorities are going to be food and beverage manufacturing, strategies to manage industrial heat, which is very prominent in the metals sector, and looking for pilot projects for something called industrial symbiosis, which is a resource efficiency approach for industry. We're also partnering with Portland State University and other stakeholders to go after funding to implement those recommendations and to do some additional research. And then, of course, it's important to mention the Inflation Reduction Act, which will be a major factor in our ability to meet the goals. Industrial decarbonization and innovation have emerged as a high priority for the Biden administration. And so we're really hopeful that we'll be able to access federal funds to carry out this work. Next slide. So if we do this right, we'll not only meet our carbon reduction goals, but also have the added benefit of reduced air pollution and waste from the industrial sector. Long term, we hope that this helps create a strong local ecosystem for clean manufacturing. Portland has always had an active industrial sector as long as we have existed as a city. So we really see this as the time to help industry meet the challenge of a cleaner future and be resilient to a changing economy. We want to help develop some pilot projects that demonstrate Portland can be a laboratory for industrial innovation. This is an opportunity to solve some pretty unique problems and continue our position as a city at the forefront of climate action and recognized at the global scale. And then finally, I mentioned this at the top of my presentation, but the Clean Industry Initiative is at the core of our Just Transition strategy. We recognize the legacy of manufacturing in Portland's history. It is a sector that employs a high proportion of BIPOC workers and pays good wages to people that don't have a college degree. So as the industrial sector transitions to a cleaner, more equitable future, we're committed to making sure that it remains a place of opportunity for frontline workers and communities. That's my whole presentation. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Clean Industry Initiative. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Andrea Jacob.
Well, thanks to both of you. It's actually not for me yet, but we're going to have some questions. This is the Q&A time. So we have some active questions in the chat. And so maybe we should address those first, and then we can go to live questions or anything that hasn't been addressed in the chat, I guess, because some of us have been adding content there. Eli, I'm going to kick it back to you to sort of manage us through this next little bit. I'm not sure who's actually on deck for Q&A.
That works for me. I think that the questions that have been posted in there have been answered. But if either the folks who have posed a question or somehow I missed one, feel free to raise your hand or add it back to the chat, and that way we can answer those. Or if you have any additional questions, we'd be happy to check in about those.
Sonrisa may have some additional thoughts on Kristen's question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Kristen's question, it seems like some of these stats on industry emissions stand to pit short-term economic development against long-term climate change. How do you plan to navigate that in the near future? Can you say more about what you mean by pitting them against each other? Okay, I'm not sure if she can hear me. Well, I think that this is actually a long-term economic development strategy. Maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, but this is something that we hope to address with the Inflation Reduction Act to make immediate investments, or maybe not immediate, but short-term investments into our industrial sector, which might not be ready to take on huge investments in new technology immediately, but there's a lot of work to be done to kind of get ready for the transition. And so we're working with Prosper Portland to really kind of prepare and build a lot more of a community of practice in our industrial sector around climate change and climate awareness. So we are working pretty closely with PSU and with industrial businesses to figure out how we can funnel short-term investment to them that will actually help them stay resilient over the long term. But I want to make sure I understood your question right. So I want to give you a chance to weigh in if you want to add more context to that. I'm not sure if she can hear me, but
We'll move on. Thank you though for those thoughts.
Does anyone else have any other lingering or additional questions that either of those presentations or on the project as a whole? Joe.
Yeah, I had a comment about the plan in the aggregate. And in particular, I wanted to focus on transportation emissions and actual reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, as you noted, transportation is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Portland. It's increasing. If anything, your report has understated the amount of the increase. The data we have from the federal government from their DARTE project says that there's been about a 16 or more percent increase in transportation emissions in the Portland area in the last 5 years for which their data. So we're actually going pretty rapidly in the wrong direction. And the previous climate action plan adopted in 2015 was very explicit and very clear about the need for vehicle miles traveled reductions. And it called for basically a 45% reduction in VMT. And I don't see any comparable clarity in the current climate emergency plan. I don't see any definitive statement of policy that we're going to shoot for a reduction in VMT. And I don't see that we're acknowledging that we're actually failing, that we're seeing an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And I appreciate that, the individual proposals like providing for vehicle electrification might facilitate some movement, but there's just no indication that the steps that are being proposed are anywhere close to being commensurate with the goal that we've set. So I'd just like to get a reaction to that. And I'll post a link to the facts and analysis on that in the chat.
So there's a lot of us that could probably take pieces of that answer, and we collaborate closely with the Portland Bureau of Transportation. So much of the data in our pathways analysis relies on data and modeling from PBOT. So not to kick the can, but just to understand the relationship between BPS and PBOT and this plan. So my understanding of the data are that VMT in Portland are actually remaining rather flat, but so not that people are driving more, but just that more people are driving. And so Kyle will have maybe some answers to add on the emission side, and then Ingrid can probably talk about PBOT strategy a little bit more in terms of how they're preferred policy scenario, and Kyle and Ingrid, feel free to weigh in on your perspectives and working with PBOT on their and their inventory strategy and their policy strategy. But I go just in aggregate, I would say you're right that their goals are not quite the same as our goals. We have a little bit of their preferred scenario doesn't get us all the way there. So if you look at our pathways analysis, you'll see that we account for that by really increasing the amount of miles that we have to electrify, because we aren't going to get there from just the VMT reduction that they have planned for. So we would agree with you on that. But I'll kick it over to Kyle or Ingrid for you to weigh in with any more context.
Gonna see if Ingrid was gonna jump in, but I'll go ahead and just say that I think it's important to note that the work plan is only 3 years, so through 2025. So what's included, the actions in the work plan are not nearly enough to get us to the goal, but there are key actions that we need to take in the first 3 years. And so that's important to understand here. The other thing I would note is in their preferred scenario, they do have a lot of actions related to VMT, broader than what's in the transportation section of the work plan, because that's of course only the next 3 years. So what you saw in our pathways analysis is modeling all the work that they would do before 2030. So we're getting a much steeper reduction from that full bundle of activities that includes transportation demand management strategies, pricing strategies, parking strategies, all around, shooting to reduce VMT in addition to the work on electrification. So PBOT is certainly focused on VMT reduction. We certainly cannot get to climate goals without significantly reducing VMT. And I'm sure that Ingrid would say the same thing as well. And PBOT would agree on that as well. So I think we certainly agree with you on all of those points, Joe.
I just echo what Kyle says. So PBOT's main focus is reducing VMT. They do a little work on transportation electrification, but their main bulk of their work is making it easier for people to walk, bike, and take public transit. There have also been some pretty robust conversations about how do we do foundational change with regards to pricing our transportation system in a way that incentivizes people to drive less. So there have been a lot of conversations about road usage charges, tolling, cordons, and all sorts of different tools for incentivizing people to drive less and to drive electric. Some of those conversations have been on hold with after the pandemic and the focus on housing. And so it will be interesting to see kind of how those conversations unfold in the next few years.
Yeah, and Ingrid, I would also add in their modeling, they use a program called Vision Eval. And that modeling showed of all the actions that they modeled, the single biggest contributor to reducing carbon emissions was pricing. And so that is definitely something that is going to be really important to get there. And I think, Joe, if I recall from prior conversations with you, you agree that pricing will be important as well. So I think it'll be key for us to continue advocating for that as we move forward as a community.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I have no doubt that, we all agree that reducing VMT is an important strategy. The question is, are the actions that are in the climate emergency plan going to measurably move us along the target to reducing VMT? And the previous climate action plan was very clear, very specific, very quantitative about where we had to get to. And essentially all I hear here is good intentions. And there's no question, pricing is a great strategy. What's our pricing policy? When is it implemented? How is it much is it going to reduce VMT and greenhouse gases? And I think we're at a point where it isn't just enough to profess good intentions and describe useful strategies. It's a matter of saying specifically what strategies and in what amounts and what policies are we going to pursue that are going to get us on track to reduce greenhouse gases from transportation, when in fact they are actually increasing. And if you go to the link that I sent, there's the federal data on greenhouse gas emissions in Portland. Multnomah County's inventory shows exactly the same thing. Greenhouse gases from transportation are increasing. That means our climate strategy right now is failing. And I just want to know what we're going to do to correct that.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments, and we're certainly not going to solve it tonight, but your comments are heard, and we can have a separate conversation, maybe offline, or maybe connect you with PBOT to really understand where they're coming from and where their strategies are. And a lot of this comes down to elected leadership. We are bureaucratic staff who can put forward the best ideas, but we're operating in a political environment, and the decision makers are not us, unfortunately. So
Can I just add, Andrea, that a lot of those options for pricing are outlined in the website I just posted, pricing options for equitable mobility. Like, it's pretty well outlined, and the next step is really political championship. And so I think that's kind of where we're stuck.
Yes, and PBOT is facing, a budget cliff, which has been published in the newspaper. So I think they're working on solving for that. And yeah, overall, we have our work cut out for us on transportation, and we need political leadership in this new. So maybe that's a good segue. If no one has any questions, I can talk a little bit about some leadership opportunities coming forward for climate. But I want to make sure that other people have a chance to ask questions.
I had a question too, and I think it's probably also related to PBOT, but it's just, the intersection of transportation emissions and equity. That article came out recently that talked about on all of Portland's public transit, there were traces of meth found. And that really doesn't make people want to use public transit. People don't, besides, what costs more, what costs less, like, people just fundamentally don't feel safe on public transit. I've taken public transit because I feel like it's the right thing to do for the climate. But while taking public transit, I've been, asked for drugs, right? I've been approached by people. It's been an uncomfortable and unpleasant experience. And I think probably most of us on this call who have taken public transit have had similar experiences, right? And so, my question, and maybe it's better for PBOT, but I think that, when we're talking about, the climate and reducing our emissions again, right? Like, EVs are a good part of it, shifting that, but we just really need to get people feeling safe, right? Feeling safe walking, feeling safe on public transit, feeling safe. And I think that there's definitely been, progress made, but on public transit, I really have felt like significantly less safe, especially since the pandemic, on public transit. So I don't know if that's something that this team can address or is thinking about, or is better for PBOT, but it's just something that I feel like is a big piece to the puzzle that we have to solve for, in addition to pricing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's also higher risks and more fear depending on what your demographic is, right? Or how far you need to go on the bus. So that's also, it's something that PBOT is aware of. It is in PBOT's bucket. But, post-pandemic ridership has declined on TriMet, and we are trying to figure out how to get that ridership back up, because the funding is also connected to ridership levels.
Yeah, that's key. That's that's a key thing for me. And we have there's great routes in the city, right, to connect people. Like there's a bus line that goes right outside my house. It's not that the routes aren't there, right? In some cities, they don't even have routes. People can't even take it, but it's just that it exists, but people feel unsafe. So I feel like that's just really important.
Yeah, and transit needs to be the anchor of any transportation system. PSEF is putting, I think, about $20 million into increasing transportation wallets. So that's vouchers for transit as well as electric bike share and e-scooters for low-income Portlanders. And they're doubling the amount to go towards that, which should hopefully increase ridership. But that's, yeah, it's just kind of part of the puzzle, and there needs to be a lot more focus, and it's kind of multi-organizational focused, working with TriMet as well as PBOT and us.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to move us on because we're getting close to the end here. So in terms of what's next, I wanted to discuss just a couple of things related to climate that are not necessarily programmatic for the BPS climate team that you see here tonight, but that are really important for the community and for the climate at large. So the first thing is that under the direction and leadership of Commissioner Carmen Rubio, who is our Bureau's commissioner in charge in the current government system, we're in the midst of standing up a new commission to serve as a key accountability body for all things climate in city business. So this is right now being called the Sustainability and Climate Commission, or SCC. It will act as a bridge between boards, commissions, elected officials, staff, and the community, both internally to the city, capital C city, and with our many partners across the city, lowercase c. So ultimately, it will definitely be an advisory body, and I think it is also intended to have decision-making power for city projects, programs, and policies that could have an impact on our climate. And so, for example, as has been mentioned, the Climate Emergency Work Plan is a 3-year plan. It was sort of a stopgap in terms of climate action plans. We needed to have a current climate action plan after the 2015 one sort of expired in 2020, but this is not the end all be all. And so the SCC will have a key role in leading the city's next climate action plan. So the public involvement process has already begun for this commission. We anticipate City Council to weigh in by the end of this calendar year. There is currently an open survey to gather additional community input for the formation of the Sustainability and Climate Commission, and that link is just been dropped in the chat. So you can take that survey and weigh in on the development of this really important body. And there'll also be regular updates on the BPS website. So I do think this is a really important function of accountability and transparency that we haven't had in the city for a long time, and it's a bit of a missing link. So I think this is going to be really important, and looking forward to seeing how it develops. And I encourage everyone to get involved in that. And then lastly, I just want to say a few words about the Portland Clean Energy Fund, or PCEF, which many of you know about and read about in the local press. And PCEF is also housed at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. It's kind of a sister program. If you think of this climate team that's here as really a policy and research shop, and you know, kind of program design and development, PCEF is really a grant investment fund. And with many of the same, we share the same aims to make you know, Portland more climate resilient and more equitable, specifically focusing on frontline communities and communities of color. So PCEF recently published its first climate investment plan. It's a 5-year roadmap into the climate action investments they're going to make. And it's a pivotal step in advancing a climate resilient Portland. It does support the city's goals of being net zero carbon by 2050. And it prioritizes, as I mentioned, frontline communities, including low income populations, communities of color, and people experiencing disabilities. So lots of folks are very interested in PCEF. And so we thought that we would use this forum, this climate conversation, to host the PSEF team. So that will happen at our next climate conversation, exact date TBD, but in the first quarter of 2024. So they will go in depth into their climate investment plan and maybe even feature some of their grantees and some of the success stories that they're having. So that is coming up. And with that, our formal presentation is finished. And we have a few more minutes if folks have like last thoughts or comments or conversation you want to have about anything that's been said. We are still here for you for a few more minutes. And if not, you're welcome to go on with your evening. And thanks again for your attention.
I would also like to just add that we have a very short survey, which I'll put into the chat to help give some ideas of what worked for this, worked for you on this, and what didn't, and what you would like to see us talk about in the future, as it is part of that conversation.
So one other question, and this is like my first time attending, so maybe this is a really basic question, but when we're talking about measuring carbon emissions and how we're doing and how we think we're going to be doing, how does this group go about measuring that? Like, I know Joe was referencing like the federal government has a measurement system, and so can you explain that in a little more detail of how do we measure how we're doing?
That's a great question, Teresa. So we follow the U.S. Community Protocol for local greenhouse gas emissions, and that kind of spells out the methodology that we follow. As much as possible, we try to track direct data around sales of kilowatt hours, therms of gas, gallons of gasoline, that kind of thing. Some data sources actually have to be modeled where we don't have actual data, like, for example, fugitive emissions. And other sources like fossil fuels, it's considered proprietary, and we have to use state level data that's released by the U.S. Energy Information Administration to make estimates about local consumption. So there are some really challenging sectors where the data has to be modeled, but for the vast majority of emissions, we have really pretty solid data. Our top source is electricity, which comes from electricity sales. So that's directly reported by our local utilities. We also include emissions from landfill waste and wastewater treatment and other processes that require some modeling to determine those emission sources, but all in line with the U.S. Community Protocol for greenhouse gas emissions, which is the same protocol that all cities in the United States follow. Did that answer your question? If you have any more, looking for
that's helpful. And then is that similar to what Joe was referring to at the federal level, or is that different?
It is different. That's a particular data set that's been released by the federal government, but it's only very recent years. So one of the challenges for Portland is that we've been tracking our emissions back to 1990, and that 2030 50% reduction target is 50% below 1990 levels. So that limits the data sources that we can use, because we need to be able to measure that back to 1990. But we do use other sources like Joe mentioned to kind of calibrate and just make sure that we're in the ballpark with where we should be. And we're always looking for ways to refine the inventory as much as possible. So when new data sources become available, we try to bring those in. I typically make updates every year to refine and improve the inventory.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Kyle, is it true that one of the reasons why it sounded like I was saying different data than Joe is because the data that I was referring to is between now and 1990, and he was looking at just the last 3 to 5 years. So it just looked different. It wasn't contradicting each other. It was just looking at different time periods.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, just in the last year from 2021 to the most current inventory is 2021. So emissions dropped in the transportation sector in 2020 and increased 8% just to 2021. So emissions now are higher than they were before the pandemic for transportation. And the data Joe shared is the last 5 years. So it does, when you're talking percentages, it does depend on what your denominator there is.
Yeah, and I really feel like some of that's like the COVID effect, right? Like when the comment I was making earlier about public transit, it's not, it's not unique to Portland, right? Even my brother lives in Chicago, and a lot of people during the pandemic, they got nervous about sharing germs, so they were like normally on public transit, shifted off of public transit, and then didn't make that switch back to public transit after the pandemic, right? So, I think when you see that in the data, that to me, that makes sense. But again, that's another factor that we have to solve for, and again, more of a PBOT thing, but, definitely
Yeah.
something we need to think about.
Yeah, the safety issues and perceived safety issues are real.
Mhm.
With that, thank you everyone for coming and joining and being part of the conversation. We do have a follow-up tomorrow that for another event, it's the same information, but if you have any burning questions that haven't been answered, you're welcome to join us then or to reach out to one of us from the team. Hope you all have a lovely evening.
Thank you.